Welcome to Season 3 of Feminism Today. The Newtown Creek is one of the most polluted bodies of water in the nation, fouled by more than a century of sewage overflows, oil spills, and industrial waste. The coastline of this 3.8-mile waterway, located along the border of Brooklyn and Queens in New York, is lined with wastewater facilities, factories, warehouses, and oil storage tanks. Willis Elkins is the executive director of Newtown Creek Alliance, a community-based nonprofit dedicated to revealing, restoring, and revitalizing Newtown Creek, a Superfund waterway in New York. Willis Elkins, welcome to Feminism Today.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
So I've been reading so much about this, and I think, from the outset, I come at this from an academic perspective, but reaching into the work of non-for-profit organizations, I'm really worried and troubled by the pattern of environmental destruction across our nation and certainly our waterways. The EPA added the creek to the Superfund National Priorities List in 2010. However, the EPA has delayed the cleanup of Brooklyn's toxic Newtown Creek Superfund site until 2032. What's going on here?
Great question. Well, as background, the creek is one of the most polluted waterways in the country, and it's fairly extensive, 4 miles, and we have some of the largest underground oil spill in the history of the country borders the creek. Another new federal Superfund site now in Greenpoint. So there's been dumping into this waterway for about 170 years. And so these are some of the first industrial toxins that were produced, were manufactured here and ended up in the bottom of the creek. And because the water is so stagnant, all that stuff has just sat there for decades and decades and decades. So it's highly polluted. It's also very complicated because you have all this pollution coming in from the land, from groundwater as well. So we know that it's a difficult site to clean up. But this process has gone on for a very long time. As you mentioned, 12 years since the designation, and it's going to be about another 6 years from now until we have an actual cleanup plan in place. And so we just sort of got news of this 5-year delay for the original timeline. So we're really sort of disheartened by the slow progress that's happening here on Newtown Creek.
So what I'm also reading in the EPA report is this new timeline also estimates that the larger cleanup of the entire creek would not only not begin until 2032, but that they're seeing a longer time. There's more work to be done. Can you tell us a little bit about the toxins and pollutants in the creek?
Sure. So there are numerous industrial pollutants, and these are all sorts of chemicals that are harmful to wildlife and harmful to humans. If we're coming in contact with those. So the EPA has identified a health risk. If someone is out eating fish or crabs or having regular exposure to the creek, primarily the sediments at the bottom, they're going to be ingesting those chemicals. And so these can cause things like birth defects, cancers, et cetera. And these are the sort of chemicals that don't break down easily. Things like PCBs, PAHs, heavy metals, dioxins. And so there's a lot of severity here in terms of the contamination. In terms of the delay, yes, we're looking about 5 years later than what we had originally anticipated, and we can sort of talk through what the reason for that delay is. But it's very concerning on our side because any amount of delay here is allows this waterway to remain highly polluted. And it means that people cannot safely interact with it, that the wildlife is being harmed, that people's health is still being put at risk.
The Newtown Creek Superfund Site Community Advisory Board is the main forum for members of the public to engage in the Superfund process. Can you tell us a little bit more about their role over time and in terms of what they're doing and what types of projects they've been engaging in, not just around Newtown Creek, but these types of bodies, what they're doing across the country?
Sure. So with pretty much every Superfund site, there is what's known as a CAG, Community Advisory Group, that's set up. And on Newtown Creek, ours is comprised of everything from local residents, stakeholders, there's business owners, There's people that work for organizations that have a vested interest in the surrounding community. And we have monthly meetings, primarily with the EPA. All of our meetings are public, open to everybody to come and get updates from the EPA, get updates from other agencies that have a stake, updates from the responsible parties. That's entities like Exxon and National Grid and the City of New York. And it's the main sort of forum to receive updates and to give feedback to the EPA, because a large part of this process, although the Superfund cleanup can be very complicated, very technical, it's very important that the community understands what's going on and is able to raise their concerns, because they're the ones obviously that are impacted by the longstanding pollution that's here.
You mentioned Exxon and some other stakeholders who are actively engaged in these types of conversations. One, do you know how many Superfund sites there are in the country? Do we have any data on that? And two, I'm wondering who the polluters are. Who have historically been the polluters of these creeks?
Yeah, so nationwide, I'm not sure what the most latest number, but I believe it's around 1,400 federal Superfund sites. And so those sort of cycle through. Sometimes they take a few years for the federal government to oversee a cleanup. Sometimes, like in the case of Newtown Creek, it'll take decades for that to happen. So, and sites are always being added. We just got a new site added in New York City, which borders Newtown Creek here in Greenpoint, called the Meeker Avenue Plume. So, that's basically the overview of the amount of Superfund sites. In terms of, for Newtown Creek, we have what are called potentially responsible parties, or PRPs. And so the original group that was identified was 5 corporate entities. That's ExxonMobil, BP Oil, Chevron, National Grid, and Phelps Dodge, which was a former copper refinery that was here. In addition to those 5 corporate entities that all had major operations, or their predecessors had major operations here, very clear case as to why they're responsible for the pollution. The City of New York was also added as a potentially responsible party. And that's in large part because of the contamination that comes through our sewer lines into the creek as well.
You talk a little bit about sort of the very clear reasons why these companies you cited, potentially responsible. But can you tell the public a little bit about the types of how were they polluting the waters?
No, that's great. A great question. So, we had some of the earliest fossil fuel production facilities in the world were here. The first kerosene factory that ever existed about 170 years ago was here on the banks of Newtown Creek. Some of the first oil refineries. So we had massive fuel production, fuel storage. And of course, 100 plus years ago, there was not very little environmental regard or regulations in place. And these were the early days of refining. So there was a lot of stuff that was just intentionally dumped into the ground or intentionally dumped into the creek, or there was poor management practices. And so a lot of it is related to petroleum related industries. We also had other really sort of harmful industries here as well. As I mentioned, metal refining, chemical factories, sort of stuff like that. So there's a very long history of the contamination. Fortunately, although the creek is still industrial, we don't have the same level of contamination sources that we used to have, in large part due to environmental laws from the past 50 years. But we're still dealing with the consequences, the remnants of industrial growth and industrial pollution that had basically no regulation on it for many, many decades.
I think the biggest challenge for my students, especially in the classroom, is this question around how can we reconcile competitive market growth with environmental degradation, couched in this language of some of the negative externalities associated with economic activity. What's your sense of how we do this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so one of the interesting things about our organization is we're obviously very focused on environmental justice, cleanup of the creek, protection of human health. And we want this waterway to be clean for the wildlife that's been here for thousands of years, and for the people that live and work here every day. We also believe in access and reconnecting the community to this waterway. But one of the other sort of interesting facets of our mission is that we want to preserve this as a working area. So our long-term vision for the creek is not just one that is clean and has more greenery and public access, but is still a working area where there's blue-collar manufacturing jobs that are located here. It's very important, obviously, for a city the size of New York. And so for us, the challenge is to find ways that we can have industrial manufacturing uses along the creek that aren't creating any sort of significant, environmental impacts on the surrounding communities. And it's certainly a challenge. We have, still large factories, waste transfer stations, lots of trucks coming and going through the area, emissions from different facilities and plants. So, we believe that there is a path forward to make this as a model of one that is an environment that's clean and economically productive. But it's certainly a challenge. And you have big industries like fossil fuel and big oil that are still here that we're sort of actively, we need to transition and get beyond that.
Right. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the health impacts.
Sure.
Studies are still underway to better understand the full scope of the consequences of this pollution over time. You've mentioned 170 years. Health Department surveys in 1992 reported a higher rate of stomach cancers and some forms of leukemia in the Greenpoint, Williamsburg area. Can you speak to any of this data?
Sure. I mean, so one of the things that's very difficult is really understanding the direct impacts that Newtown Creek as a water body or certain facilities around the creek have had on the surrounding populations. We know without a doubt that there have been elevated rates of certain kinds of cancers around the creek and large, significant amounts of personal histories from people whose families have lived here for generations and experience all sorts of health impacts. The difficulty is to assess what the root cause of some of those illnesses is, especially in a place where in the middle of New York City, we're next to the BQE, we have all these different sort of potential sources of contamination and health impact. So it's very hard to sort of determine and say, ExxonMobil, the oil spill is responsible for X, 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 and X. Also, as time goes on, it's harder to do this sort of analysis and research because people move away, people pass on. It's harder to sort of collect data. One thing that's kind of interesting is that the EPA's approach with the Superfund is that they're not doing a comprehensive health study to sort of get reconciliation and understanding. They're basically saying, we know what's here now, and we know that poses a direct risk via these channels. Like I was saying, like eating fish or coming in contact with the sediment of the creek. So the EPA's approach is a little different in that regard. It's not a health study, but it is basically clearly showing that there are health risks associated with some of the industrial pollution that's still here.
I wonder how much collaboration is being done between your organizations and other climate projects around the country.
That's a great question. We work a lot with a lot of other New York City-based organizations that have similar missions that may also be dealing with similar issues on other waterways. For instance, Gowanus Canal. We work very closely with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy on a number of different projects and strategies. Larger organizations like Riverkeeper, that's based out of the Hudson. We really kind of grew out of Riverkeeper about 20 years ago. And there's a number of other sort of waterways and environmental groups around the city that we work very, very closely with in that regard. In terms of larger scale around the country, it's a great idea. There's obviously plenty of Superfund sites and a lot of relevant ones to look at. It's just it can be a very time-consuming process to find all those sites and develop all those relationships. But
right.
We very much value the relationships with a lot of city and regional organizations.
Right. I mean, I think my question was, are there efforts to synchronize the strategy in terms of cleanup and remediation?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question. I think it is something that has come up through the Superfund process quite a bit, is that the way these unfold, right, is that there's a toxic site in someone's backyard. The EPA comes in, says, we're going to use our federal resources to get this cleaned up, and we want to engage the community. Most members of society are not, toxicologists or understand hydrology and movement of chemicals through the sediments. So it's a very technical process. And, regular stakeholders around the community are not prepared to deal with that. So it is, I think there's a bit of a little bit of a flaw in the system, because like you're saying, you have hundreds of community groups like this around the country that are dealing with the same issues and learning all this stuff for the first time. The EPA does have resources available. So our CAG, we have both a facilitator who's worked on other Superfund sites, who help us organize the meetings and make sure they run smoothly and advance the agenda on behalf of the community. We also have a technical advisor who we can call in to help with, when there's a report being released and analysis. But overall, it's very difficult and daunting for regular people to try and dive in and understand what the chemical contamination means and how it impacts their lives directly.
The EPA, to this point is, and I don't know if this is part and parcel, sort of part of the bigger issue. The EPA is now proposing to split the cleanup into smaller units. For example, I'm wondering why that is. Is it because it's just too much to manage, or what's the source of this decision?
So they're looking at doing basically an early action at one smaller section of the creek. And in large part, it's because they want to be able to sort of test out certain kinds of potential remedies before doing the whole waterway. So right now they sort of targeted on the specific tributary of the creek that is fairly indicative, has a lot of similar characteristics of the rest of the waterway, and would also be easier to work in because it's not an active maritime site, so you don't have to deal with traffic as much. So we're learning more about this proposal from the EPA, and we feel if we believe this is going to help expedite the entire cleanup and move things along in a way that is not just quick but thorough, right? We're really concerned about the timeline, but we also want to make sure that the actual cleanup we get is the one we need and deserve, and that's protective of environmental and human health. So we're still learning more from the EPA about this potential early action cleanup.
Right. As I've been conducting research, trying to dig my teeth into all that's going on in the waterways across the country, I've been coming across a lot of different terms, and I want you to help us here. I've been reading about black mayonnaise. What's this?
Black mayonnaise is a colloquial term for what is at the bottom of the creek. So you have, as I mentioned, 170 years of both industrial contamination and municipal contamination. When I say municipal, I'm talking about our sewer systems. Newtown Creek, like all of New York Harbor and a lot of older cities, gets untreated sewage and stormwater dumped directly into the waterway during most rain events. So, and it's much better now than it was 150 years ago. So in addition to the chemicals, which are very dangerous for human health, you also have all this organic material that's been dumped into the creek for so long. And so this has created this sort of sludge at the bottom of the waterway that essentially looks like black mayonnaise. So if you think about like the bottom of any other sort of water body, you might have something that was like maybe more sandy. There are muddy bottoms, obviously, with fine sediments, but the mud we have at the bottom of our creek is not very natural, and it's highly dangerous. So the black mayonnaise is, an interesting term to describe that.
I'm also, I was poking around your website. I saw some images of you and your team out there on the water in very colorful boats. I don't know if it's a recreational. Tell us a little bit about what's going on with that.
So, well, there's a few things. One is that our organization does a lot of environmental monitoring. And so we work closely with not just other organizations like Riverkeeper that do environmental monitoring, but also close academic partners, including LaGuardia Community College. So we've been doing water sampling for many years of the creek to better understand the conditions and how those change, on a sort of day-to-day basis. So that is work we do on the water. We're also trying to do, where we can, restoration work. You'll see some of the shovels behind me here. Yeah. This is all for upland sites. So it's very difficult to do a lot of work in the creek, in large part because of the contamination. So we're trying to find ways to do restoration in safe manners in places that also surround the creek. So we do a lot of planting projects and cleanups on the shorelines, areas that are close to the waterway as well. Additionally, there's the waterway is a significant maritime industrial area. So there are barges and tugboats that are using the creek every single day for moving in and out material. There's also recreational use, canoeing that happens on the creek. There's an organization, the North Brooklyn Community Boathouse, which has been doing that for about a decade and take educational tours in very large canoes out onto the waterway so that people can see and learn and understand all the past history, and then also all that's there. There is a big resurgence, recovery, and repopulation of wildlife that's happened as well.
I mean, what's interesting about what you are doing and how you're actively engaging in this cleanup process is that Newtown Creek is actually lined with active industrial businesses, as you just mentioned, including scrap yards, recycling centers, concrete plants, and trucking facilities. And I'm wondering if this is slowing down the process at all. How are residents to make sense of what's happening?
You mean in terms of slowing down the cleanup, or?
Yeah.
Yeah, not really. I mean, a lot of the on-land operations, the focus of the creek work of the Superfund process is on the waterway itself. There are studies where they're having to put in wells around the creek and do, looking at groundwater movement and things like that. So the current uses don't necessarily have a direct impact on slowing down the cleanup per se. There is concerns about recontamination. So some of these industrial sites around the creek have not been cleaned up. And so you have facilities like, let's say, the National Grid site, which is over 100 acres, has been polluted for about 100 years. The soil is heavily contaminated. We're very concerned that that contamination is going into the waterway. On top of that, they're also looking to expand their facility and double down on fossil fuel infrastructure. So there's a lot of concern about some of the current operations around the creek and how they are either potentially still contributing to contamination related to Superfund, but also contributing to other pollution sources like air pollution and impacting nearby residents and local workers that way as well.
Let's talk a little bit about what the creek tells us about human disease and human development over time. Very recently, I heard a report at Columbia University where researchers were actually this is interesting. The researchers at Columbia University were actually taking samples, water samples from the residents of the undergraduate students on campus to sort of track disease, especially COVID. And I'm wondering what you think, what you've learned about this with the Newtown Creek, but also what do you think, what does the evidence in the creek tell us about human development and human disease over time?
Oh, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm trying to think of the sort of best way to answer that. I think that in terms of, disease, I mean, I'd say one sort of anecdotal thing is that we have, along Newtown Creek, we have the largest wastewater treatment plant in the city, the Newtown Creek treatment plant. And that's actually become a major resource for studying the transmission and spread of disease around New York City. So they started doing sampling for things like COVID in the wastewater, right? Because if something's in our body, it's passing through our body and going into the wastewater. So it's very easy for them to, not easy, but they've done a very good job of being able to sort of track when there's going to be outbreaks potentially or concentrations of viruses in the city. So that's very interesting. But also that, the treatment plant is, it's cleaning a lot of stuff, but it's not really cleaning everything. So there's other things that we put in our body, like pharmaceuticals, that pass through our body and also pass through a treatment plant and enter our waterways that way as well. So I think in terms of like the history of a place like Creek and disease, it, often in the 1800s, places like this where, could be could have been a place where there was more disease going because of the conditions that were there. And New York has a lot of history of that as well, of places where there was poor sanitation, stagnant water, things like that. So, we used to have giant, basically manure piles here where they would bring in waste from the city, from all the horses in the 1800s. We had massive rendering plants where they would bring in dead animals from the streets of New York. And so we had Newtown Creek has always had a lot of history in the past 200 years of handling waste, primarily waste of a large part of New York City. So with waste often comes disease as well.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the demographics, right? The
Mhm.
people who live in the surrounding community. Are these generally poor people? Are they disenfranchised? Like, who lives near this creek?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, one of the difficult things is that Newtown Creek has a lot of neighborhoods that border it. So you have on the Brooklyn side, you have Greenpoint, East Williamsburg, and Bushwick. On the Queen side, you have Ridgewood, Maspeth, Blissville, Sunnyside, Long Island City. And so, a lot of these neighborhoods are very different in terms of their demographics. And
Mm,
also, a lot have changed very dramatically in the past 20 years, primarily places like Greenpoint, which was traditionally a very working class neighborhood, very industrial, and has had, since a major rezoning in 2005, has gone through the roof, some of the most expensive real estate, in the country that is here. And so there's a new influx, changing demographics here. But there's other areas, East Williamsburg, Bushwick, that those are also gentrifying, but there still remains a lot of lower income residents that are in those areas as well. And so, one of the sort of challenges, there's a few challenges on this front, but
mhm,
one is sort of like, the idea of the cleanup is sort of dealing with the sins of the past and
mm.
justification for people that have suffered through living through these conditions. And then the other sort of aspect is like moving forward and making sure that, those same sort of human health risks are not, present for years to come. And it gets very difficult about, who is the cleanup for, going forward.
I've read an awful lot as well from the Department of Health in terms of these cancer cases, but also just the disease. And I'm wondering if there is a higher level of disease in this area. Historically, is it new? What are the numbers now? Do you have any health data for the public on where things are?
I don't really have, it's kind of hard to quantify how that has changed over time.
Mhm.
There have been a few sort of, studies done over the years, but it's very difficult to quantify how the health impacts or the trends in, disease or, you know, implications like that have changed over recent years,
Mhm.
unfortunately.
Yeah. So you've talked a little bit about the sins of the past and thinking forward and the work that you're doing. I wonder what advocacy and activism should look like in this particular space. There are over 1,400 Superfund sites nationwide. What does advocacy and activism look like?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that one of the right, this sort of primary question of what is the cleanup for and who is it for? And one of the difficult things that we have on Newtown Creek is that there's it's almost all industrial. It's only at the very mouth of the creek where it's actually much, much cleaner, where there's been new construction and people that are living right there. So one of the difficulties is that we as an organization believe that it's not just about residents and people that are living near the waterway, but it's also about the people that are working here every day.
Mm,
So often it's very difficult to advocate for the same sort of level of protection for industrial areas as it is for residential. And it's not to obviously discredit that residential areas don't need protection, but often some of this stuff is done on a, you look at census data to figure out who's impacted. If an area is an industrial, no one lives there, and therefore it's not even counted in a census. So it's very easy for people that could be spending, if you're spending 40, 50 hours a week for 20 years, literally right next to the creek and exposed to some of these toxins, it's very easy for that sort of pathway, those groups to not be considered in the same way. So that's sort of one avenue of, something that we try to advocate for is that the cleanup is yes for the people that are living around it, but it also needs to focus on folks that are here on a day-to-day basis and facing those health risks because of their proximity to the waterway and these other pollution sources.
Willis Elkins is the executive director of Newtown Creek Alliance in New York. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thank you so much. It was great.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.